what are the principles behind genetic modification?
Genetic modification is simply a term that means making a specific change in the genome of an organism. That's the sequence of DNA that specifies its makeup. Now, this is something we've been doing for 10,000 years by processes such as selective breeding of crops and domestic animals in order to produce the varieties we have today. But in the last 30 or so years, this has accelerated because we've developed a number of techniques that allow us to actually modify the sequence of DNA within cells. And this is really the controversial aspect of it. So this is probably best understood in terms of the debate about genetically modified crops, something which exercises both scientists and members of the public who don't really understand genetics.
So is the principle of genetic modification today any different to what it was thousands of years ago?
It is, in that it's much more accurate and the changes you can make are much more precise. So when you cross together two existing varieties, you're relying on plants doing what comes naturally to them, having sex, just like animals. But you can't control what the outcomes are. Whereas if you take a single gene and you insert it into the genome of an organism, you're making a very much more precise change.
So what have been the recent groundbreaking successes in genetic modification?
Well, I'm afraid the groundbreaking successes have been commercially successful, but have been extraordinarily unpopular, especially with environmental groups. And that's largely because the technology has been developed by multinational agrochemical companies whose principal remit is to sell more of their products to American farmers. So what we have are at the moment a very large proportion of American crops, maize, soybean, cotton, are genetically modified for one of two principal traits. That's either being resistant to herbicide, which makes profits for the companies who sell herbicide, or resistance to insect larvae, which is actually quite a beneficial thing in that it reduces the amount of insecticide that gets used.
So we are kind of helping the environment to a certain extent by genetically modifying?
Well, in fact, I think we are. It's argued that this is all in favour of, shall we say, industrialised agriculture, and certainly anyone who's been to the United States and driven across the Midwest will realise that the scenery is a soybean field followed by a maize field followed by a soybean field ad infinitum. So there's nothing particularly natural about the agricultural environment. But then that's equally true for any agricultural environment. Even organic farming is still extremely damaging to the natural environment. It's necessary to grow food. And what we have to do is to produce food as efficiently as we can because we have an awful lot of people to feed.
So we've talked a bit about the kind of environmental and ethical drawbacks, but are there any scientific drawbacks to genetic modification?
It is said that there might be risk if we introduce genes which have an unexpected effect. And for that reason, anything that's genetically modified has to be approved before it can be released into the environment, and that approval requires a case-by-case safety assessment. That's actually something we don't require for anything that's produced by normal breeding practices. Ironically, as a result of the safety testing that's now required, it's actually pushed the technology towards the companies that can afford to carry it out and away from people who might be able to produce advantages for people in the developing world and people who might need the technology more than American farmers.
So what are the difficulties that you as a scientist encounter during the scientific process of genetic modification?
Well, personally, I encounter no difficulties whatsoever because I don't work on a crop species. My research is actually carried out on a moss, and so nobody really minds if you genetically modify moss because in any case everything is carried out in the research lab and we don't release things into the environment. Actually, the only thing that happens to me is when I talk to someone, a member of the general public, and they discover I work in a moss, the first thing they ask me is, how do I kill it? I've got it in my lawn, which is a bit depressing, really, but it does show the search for the weapons of moss destruction continues.
Obviously, you don't work necessarily on controversial genetic modification, but others do, so what are the problems that they may encounter?
Well, the main problems they encounter are the public, who are largely uninformed, or at least uninformed by anyone who knows anything about the subject. We used to run a series of research projects for students in the genetics department long ago, where they would do surveys of public opinion on genetic modification, and for the most part people were against it until it was explained to it what they were. Now actually, one of the interesting things was that in Yorkshire, when it was suggested that it might deliver cheaper food, then people were all for it. Now whether that represents the public at large or the peculiar relationship between the Yorkshireman and his wallet, I'm not quite sure.
So how much does cost play a role when it comes to genetic modification?
Well, obviously it's much harder to do than it is to cross two plants together, because you need a laboratory and you need to carry out the research under controlled conditions, and you're not allowed to release what you have into the environment. You need to analyse the plants you produce at the molecular level, and this is reasonably expensive. But the actual technology is not too difficult. It doesn't require extensive instrumentation.
So what has been the most major technological breakthrough in genetic modification?
Well, it's one that's happening at the moment, really, and this is a technology which has the unmemorable name of CRISPR. This actually stands for something like clustered regularly interspaced regions in genomes or something. It's an acronym. It's in origin a mechanism that bacteria use to protect themselves against viral infection, in which they capture a piece of the viral DNA and then they turn it against a reinvasion of that virus by using that piece of DNA to direct a molecule to attack the DNA sequence.
That sounds pretty remarkable.
It's amazing, but we can use that technology simply by making a piece of DNA that looks like one of these CRISPR sequences and expressing it in a cell from an animal or a plant, and it will attack a specific sequence in the genome, and it will cause that sequence to be cut and then repaired, and the way in which that repair is carried out can be accurate or it can be error prone, and that causes changes. And this is allowing us to modify specific genes in situ in cells in living organisms, and it's got immense potential for medical and agricultural uses.
So I'm going to move it on to humans, because I'd like to ask if it's possible to genetically modify human embryos.
I'm sure it's possible, but no one's allowed to do it. So again, recently we heard a story, I think it was last week, about research planned in the new Francis Crick Institute in London, where approval was being given to carry out modification of cells derived from human embryos. These are embryonic stem cells. Now, embryonic stem cells are cells derived from early embryos which have not yet committed themselves to a developmental future, so they can develop into any tissue or organ in the body potentially. So they are really worth studying because they may improve regenerative medicine by being able to allow us to generate things like new kidneys, for example, for transplantation. And these can be genetically modified. Now, embryonic stem cells in mice can be genetically modified and reintroduced into mouse embryos to create genetically modified mice. So there's no technical reason why this shouldn't be possible in humans, other than, one, the ethical constraints and the approval there for that, and that won't be given, and the practical difficulties in that reimplantation of a modified embryo into a surrogate mother doesn't necessarily produce a healthy embryo that's going to come to term. So if we think, for example, about the cloning of Dolly the sheep, which was a major scientific miracle about 20 years ago, what people don't realize is that the scientists had 384 goes before they succeeded in producing Dolly, and most of those goes were unsuccessful, which produced aborted embryos or malformed embryos. So you can't imagine doing that kind of beta testing with humans.
So if we were to progress to a stage where it was economically and logistically possible, would genetic modification be a good thing if it were to, say, for instance, reduce the risk of cancer?
All science has risks and benefits associated with it, and these have to be looked at. on a case-by-case basis. Now, actually, I doubt whether it would ever become economically practicable to do this on a large scale. You might be able to do it on 1 or 2 people, but it's not something that's going to be able to be available to the 9 billion people we anticipate being on the planet. So when we're considering medicine, this is something that's very much for the rich.
So for those potentially very, very rich people out there in the future who have access to genetic modification of human embryos, would it be a good thing if I could choose to have children with brown eyes or blue eyes or grey eyes?
It's something that might be possible. Why anyone would want to do that, I cannot imagine. If you were to choose to have a child with blue eyes, the chances are also that it would have a fair skin and be subject to increased rates of melanoma. Actually, I think you need to look at this very carefully. I don't see the point in doing this for trivial reasons, but then if we look at most medical advances, they were introduced in the first instance to cure people with acute diseases, but now the technologies have developed so that they're cosmetic, and surgery is a classic example of this. We don't get too exercised these days about people having nip and tuck surgery. Maybe we'll be able to do this genetically at some time in the distant future, maybe we won't.
So even potentially changing the personality of a child so they're more able to cope with exams, for instance, and do better in life and earn more money. Is that
I think personality has very little to do with genetics and everything to do with upbringing and experience. People overestimate the influence of genetics. If you've got a gene for something, as they say, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to contract whatever disorder is associated with that genetic variant. And in terms of personality, you just have to look at identical twins who are not the same in terms of their personality, although they may have exactly identical genomes.